standing on the edge of floodwaters, talking with neighbours possibly for the first time since the last flood, and the tales of despair inevitably emerge. This family just moved in 2 months ago. That bloke was just about to sell. Our business barely got through COVID, and now this happens. Old mate has now been through 4 floods. Watch more on the flood disaster in the video above. But in among the sadness and empathy as people rally to help out the victims of the flooding crisis in southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales, anger festers, and uncertainty is rife. Perhaps reflecting such sentiments was Ken, whose son's home in the inner Brisbane of suburb Auchenflower was flooded. I was here in 2011 and each flood since then, doing the same work over and over again, knowing he and his family are going to have to come back and start all over again, Ken told 7 News. Until we start using our brains, learning to control the water, get some dams in. I mean, how many years have we been talking about getting dams in? A man paddles a kayak through floodwaters covering Torwood Street, Milton in Brisbane. Darren England, AAP. No government does anything about it. Difficult questions about the long-term livability of Brisbane and surrounds have been raised by the natural disaster. The head of the federal government's National Recovery and Resilience Agency, Shane Stone, caused a stir when he questioned people in the flood zone. "What do you think is going to happen?" he commented to a news outlet. Similar sentiments have been expressed on social media, but they have largely been met with calls for compassion and sensitivity. The damage bill from the disaster could top $1 billion, and insurer Suncorp's chief executive, Steve Johnston, has urged the state to build it back better. "The inevitability here is that we are going to be repairing homes that have been repaired 3 or 4 times, he said. But experts have warned that if predictions that floods will be more frequent and intense in coming decades hold true, land in flood zones could become unlivable. Resilient city. That's an absolute worst-case scenario, and positivity around Brisbane's future remains. Brisbane is an incredibly resilient city. After the last floods, there was a drop in house prices in the short term, but in the long term I think people look to the amenity that is offered by the Brisbane River and by Brisbane City," said Jen Williams, the Queensland head of the Property Council of Australia. "While there will be some short-term pain, I'm confident the resilience of Brisbane will rise up and those house prices will go back to their normal value. Each time we go through an event like this, we learn more as a city about we can handle it and be better prepared." A resident of Sherwood in Brisbane paddles through floodwaters in heavy rain. Sarah Kays for the photo pitch. Margaret Cook, a historian who wrote the book A River with a City Problem, A History of Brisbane Floods, isn't quite as optimistic. While she speaks glowingly of the lovely city that has a lot going for it, she concedes land in flood zones could probably one day be worthless. "We have already reached the point where some areas are uninsurable, and it's definitely going to devalue people's property," she said. "We live on a subtropical river system, we live on this river plain. Floods unfortunately are going to happen again. With climate change, potentially, they are going to be more frequent and more intense. And they are getting a little bit harder to predict. What's the solution?" Dr. Cook has advocated a suite of proactive, preventative measures, including retrofitting and building houses with flood-resilient materials, ensuring areas of vegetation are protected and having more grass areas in backyards and public spaces that absorb rainfall. Better forecasting and warning systems were also needed, as well as more efficient evacuation processes, she said. Then there's the issue of planning, and whether more developments should be allowed in flood areas. "We're exacerbating the problem," Dr. Cook said. "We've now in recent years built a nursing home in one of the most flood-prone sites in Brisbane, and my aunt is in that nursing home. It was evacuated in the dark, and the army had to remove the security grills to get her out. We need to stop doing things like that." Flooding in Logan, south of Brisbane, peaked on March 1st. John O'Searle, AAP. "Those sentiments are met with incredulity by the property industry. Ms. Williams says there are already an immense number of hurdles people need to jump through if they want to develop in flood areas, and they will only be strengthened following the latest disaster. Flood mapping will also be updated. But Chris Eves, an expert in the impact of natural disasters on the property market, claims they are not foolproof. Once they map the flood lines for 2022, basically as soon as they build another 100, 200 houses around the rural or peri-urban areas, then we don't know if those flood maps are going to be accurate, he said. Concerningly, Dr. Cook believes not much more can be done regarding large-scale flood mitigation measures after a range of initiatives were introduced after the 2011 flood, including backflow devices for drainage. Building a series of dams, Dr. Cook argues, is not the solution. The aftermath of the floods on Brisbane River. Russell Freeman, AAP. People think you can build dams anywhere, seemingly. Dams need very, very specific requirements: geological, topographical. They need to be in a place that most effectively catches the rain, she said. They can't be in the middle of a city. One of the places you could possibly build a dam would be on the Brisbane River, but that would possibly be right where the city is. The hydrologists and engineers I've spoken to agree there are few mitigation strategies left. Levee banks don't work. Wivenhoe Dam works really, really well in major floods, to a point. It's withheld a lot of water this time. It withheld 2 meters last time. But the bottom line is dams are finite. The view of the flooded Brisbane CBD from South Bank. John O'Searle, AAP. Hubert Chansor, a civil engineering professor at the University of Queensland, says the issue is more complicated. Dams could possibly be built on the Brisbane River and in the Lockyer Valley. And the Wivenhoe Dam, which reduced drastically the amount of flooding in Brisbane, could be raised, he believes. But that will only provide some protection, and the cost will be enormous. And we as a community have to be willing to pay the price, he said. Other proposals such as preserving or improving nature areas will have only a limited impact. Jane Knox cleaning up her flood-damaged property in the suburb of Auchenflower in Brisbane. Darren England, AAP. Grass areas will be an advantage when we are dealing with flash floods. Flash floods would be, for example, 200 millimeters of rain in 2 hours, he said. For such an event as a flash flood, yes, having grassy areas and vegetation will definitely slow down the propagation of the rainfall runoff as it goes into the catchment. But we're talking here about small, short events. Vegetation and grass areas in urban areas will have very little impact when we are dealing with a mega flood, the flood of a large catchment like Brisbane. I would call it a mega flood even if we didn't reach the same level as 2011. Life in the River City. So what will life look like in the flood zone going forward? So concerned about people in such areas is Dr. Cook that she has gone as far as to suggest councils could look at buying flood-prone houses that go on the market. We could move the more vulnerable people. We've done that before. We could speed that up. Not necessarily force people to move, but if the house went on the market, could council buy it, she said. It's more about thinking forward than always being reactive. It's a very different story if you're wealthy and you can continue to recover. My concern is we do know where these vulnerable people live. Floodwaters flowing down the Brisbane River. Tertius Picard, AP. There is strong evidence to suggest people will want to continue living in the flood zone. Property agency Buyers researched house prices in the 20 suburbs in Brisbane most impacted by the 2011 floods. In the 5 years following the disaster, 19 of those suburbs outperformed the city's house price growth benchmark, with industrial Pinkenba the only exception. The best performer was Fig Tree Pocket, which recorded 53% growth over the 5 years, compared with 26% for the city overall. They are often, of course, riverside suburbs and therefore, normally, highly sought-after locations because they are close to water, said Buyers co-founder Pete Wargent. flooding at River Bar and Kitchen in the Brisbane CBD on February 28. Peter Wallace,